Hello, and welcome to the first episode of The Tangible Darkness. Before we get into the captivating content you're here for, I believe it's essential to establish a foundation by discussing my origins and providing insight into my identity. I was born in the early 1970s in San Antonio, Texas. I'm the result of the union between teenage parents who, although officially married, predictably did not stay together for very long. They divorced shortly after my first birthday. Tragically, my only full biological sibling, Patsy, passed away a year before my birth. Given their young age, it's unsurprising that their union faltered. At the time, my mother was just 14 years old, while my father was 16. Although I have many half-siblings, I grew up as an only child. For the following 3 years, my mother single-handedly raised me while residing in my grandfather's home, alongside my 2 aunts and 1 uncle. Unfortunately, she lacked the necessary support and maturity to raise a child at such a young age. Consequently, she made the decision to grant my Aunt Isabel and Uncle Joe legal guardianship over me. This arrangement led me to reside on a 140-acre ranch located just outside San Antonio, Texas, adjacent to Highway 90. Living with my aunt and uncle presented its fair share of challenges. Due to my deep connection with my mother and unresolved feelings of abandonment, I never referred to them as my parents. These emotions, combined with other domestic circumstances, contributed to behavioral difficulties during my school years. Most of my classmates likely remained oblivious to the fact that I was not raised by my biological parents. It wasn't a matter of shame, rather, it was simple truth. While I didn't openly share this information with anyone, I also didn't actively conceal it. We lived on the ranch for a decade, and although we didn't encounter an abundance of supernatural occurrences, it was there that I had my first and one of my most unforgettable experiences. Interestingly, both of these experiences took place while my teenage aunt, Millie, was babysitting me at the time, came over while my parents went out with their friends. The first incident left me slightly unsettled, but it seemed to truly disturb my aunt. The entire evening had been rather uneventful, until it was time for me to take a bath before bedtime. Aunt Millie was in the kitchen washing dishes while I began filling the tub with water. As the water level rose, I immersed myself in the bath, patiently waiting for it to reach a desired height. It was at that moment that I distinctly heard someone call my name. The voice was feminine, and I assumed it was my Aunt Millie. Who else could it be? No one else was there besides us two. I stepped out of the bathtub, wrapped a towel around myself, and went to the kitchen to inquire as to what she needed. She stated firmly that she hadn't called me, and I dismissed it as my imagination playing tricks on me. Returning to the bathtub, I resumed filling it with water, but no sooner had I turned on the tap than I heard my name being called once again, just as clearly as the first time. By this point, I was growing irritated, convinced that my Aunt Millie was playing a prank on me. Once more, I climbed out of the tub and headed to the kitchen to confront her. She insisted, as she had before, that she hadn't called me. I persisted, insisting that she had indeed called me and accusing her of joking around. It was then that I noticed her irritated expression slowly transform into fear. She promptly began checking all the doors to ensure they were locked. Once satisfied that we were secure and confined within the house, I continued to assert that I had heard my name. At this point, she sternly instructed me to stop talking about it. There was legitimate cause for concern. The ranch was situated quite a distance from the highway, enveloped in darkness, with only the front and back porch lights casting feeble illumination. So who experiences disembodied voices? What does the paranormal community have to say about this? Is it possible to hear these voices without equipment? In general, it is possible to hear disembodied voices and unexplained sounds associated with ghosts or paranormal activity. However, such occurrences without the use of devices or gadgets are not very common. Most ghostly voices are captured through EVP, also known as electronic voice phenomenon, recordings, where the voices are often faint and require specialized equipment to be heard. Disembodied voices can range from short phrases or sentences to other sounds like growls, breathing, screaming, sobbing, or singing. It can sometimes be difficult to distinguish these voices from ordinary sound pollution or natural causes. For example, sounds from the street or animals outside can be misinterpreted as voices from inside a house. While disembodied voices can be heard without the aid of recording devices, they are more commonly associated with residual hauntings, where certain sounds or voices are replayed like a recording. Intelligent hauntings, where the entity interacts or communicates with individuals, are less frequent but do occur. Unexplained sounds in haunted locations can include footsteps, tapping, knocking, breathing, static buzzing, or other unusual noises. Some of these sounds can be attributed to sound pollution, structural adjustments in old houses, ventilation systems, or the presence of animals such as rats or birds. It's important to thoroughly investigate and eliminate all possible natural causes before considering them to be paranormal in nature. If you hear strange sounds in your home, it is advisable to rule out mundane explanations first. Temperature changes, electrical glitches, displacement of objects, strange smells, unexplained shadows, and other signs may also accompany haunting experiences. However, these signs can often be explained by natural factors or other environmental influences. When encountering disembodied voices, it is recommended to remain calm and avoid fueling fear or anxiety, as these emotions can potentially amplify the haunting. Ignoring the ghostly presence and not engaging with it may cause it to move on. However, in some cases, spirits may seek acknowledgement or have a message to deliver. In such situations, gently asking the spirit to leave or firmly expressing discomfort with its presence can be attempted. If the haunting persists or becomes more malevolent, seeking assistance from professionals such as healers, psychics, paranormal investigators, or clergy may be necessary. Cleansing techniques such as using sage, conducting prayers or rituals, or performing a house blessing can be employed to mitigate negative energies. However, it's crucial to exercise caution and consult experts when dealing with potentially dangerous or demonic entities. In some cases, hearing disembodied voices could be a sign of clairaudience, a psychic ability to perceive spirit voices. However, it is essential to consider mental health and consult professionals to rule out any psychological illnesses or hallucinations. While disembodied voices can be eerie and unsettling, they are generally not dangerous. Most often, they are associated with residual hauntings and are not interactive or harmful. However, If the voices originate from intelligent hauntings, especially involving negative or demonic entities, there is a potential for danger, including attachment, oppression, or even possession. It's crucial to be aware of the context and seek appropriate help when needed. So, what does science have to say about experiencing this type of phenomenon, such as disembodied voices? Well, hallucinations are when people experience things that aren't really there, like hearing voices. These can happen to anyone, not just people with mental disorders. Scientists have used brain imaging techniques to study hallucinations and have found that certain parts of the brain, like the auditory cortex and hippocampus, are active during auditory hallucinations. These brain areas are also connected to memory. When these connections are disrupted, it can lead to hallucinations. One possible explanation for hallucinations is a problem with a type of neuron called basket cells in the hippocampus. These cells release a chemical that helps control brain activity. If they don't work properly, it can cause overactivity in other brain cells and result in hallucinations. Other parts of the brain, like the thalamus, may also be involved in hallucinations by sending signals to the thinking part of the brain. Researchers are still learning more about how these different brain regions are connected and contribute to hallucinations. Using brain imaging, scientists are also developing treatments for hallucinations. By targeting specific brain regions and providing feedback signals, they help to restore normal brain activity and reduce or eliminate hallucinations altogether. In conclusion, although we don't fully understand the exact reasons behind hallucinations, studying the brain through imaging has given us valuable insights. These findings could help better understand and treat hallucinations in the future. Now, I know that was a mouthful, but even though I have had quite a few experiences with the paranormal, I do like to keep an open mind, and I do consider myself to be what I like to call an open-minded skeptic. I have to see proof, compelling evidence, or witness things for myself before I consider something to be paranormal in nature. Now, back to my story. Shortly after the initial encounter, the second and most profound experience occurred, forever altering my life at the ranch. Once again, Aunt Millie was looking after me while my parents were out with friends. The evening leading up to bedtime was unremarkable, with nothing unusual taking place. It wasn't until later that night that everything on the ranch changed drastically. What I once considered to be a peaceful place of beauty transformed into a realm of absolute terror. In the middle of the night, I was awakened from my slumber. The entire house was enveloped in silence and darkness, and I was confident that my parents had returned and were fast asleep as well. The house itself was quite aged. It was at least 100 years old. During the summer months, it was customary for all of my bedroom windows to be left open. For reasons that escape me now, I felt a strange urge to get out of bed and peer through the window. It was then that I noticed a dark figure standing on the other side of the white picket fence, staring back at me. The moonlight provided enough illumination to discern the outline of a person wearing a small hat, resembling a pork pie hat, with their hands resting on the individual pickets. However, the light was insufficient to make out any specific features. The figure remained motionless, fixated on me, and a sense of panic began to consume me. Hastily, I turned away from the window and shook Aunt Millie in an attempt to wake her from her sleep. She groaned but remained unresponsive, deep in her slumber. My panic escalated, and I rushed back to the window to check if the figure was still there. To my dismay, it was still present, standing motionless, but now continuing to stare in my direction. At this point, I referred to it as an it rather than a person, as something about its movement felt horribly non-human. What happened next seemed far from the way a human would move. As I continued to gaze out the window, the figure reached out and grasped the next picket to the right of each hand, proceeding to walk sideways in parallel with the fence. It continued this peculiar mode of movement, causing my discomfort to intensify. Unable to bear it any longer, I leaped back into bed and pulled the covers tightly over me. From this point on, my recollection becomes hazy. While the preceding events were vivid and permanently etched in my memory, the subsequent memories are faint and fragmented. I vaguely remember a dog running off into the woods. Although this memory does not feel connected to the overall experience, it remains a fragment I recall. The second experience had a profoundly traumatizing effect on me. From that point on, sleeping alone at night became an entirely different ordeal. I developed peculiar bedtime rituals and behaviors. I always felt the need to conceal the fact that I was in bed, thinking that if I made it appear as though no one was there, it would offer some sort of protection. I would carefully smooth out the covers and then grab an additional blanket, which I would wrap around my head like a donut, blocking my vision and allowing me to only see the ceiling. I believed this would give the impression of an empty bed with a blanket thrown on top. At other times, in the sweltering heat of summer nights, I would sandwich my head between two pillows and sleep that way for the entire night in this suffocating sensation. These behaviors were absolute self-torture, but in my young mind, they provided a sense of security. I believed that by hiding myself in this way, I could shield myself from whatever lurking presence might be inside or outside my home. Now, this third final experience didn't happen to me directly. I was there, but I was asleep. And this occurred on the way home from a night of bowling. As my aunt and uncle drove down Highway 90, nearing the entrance to the ranch, my aunt and uncle noticed this beam of light, incredibly bright light that seemed to radiate almost from the highway itself. They both leaned out of the window and spotted an object in the sky, hovering at a relatively low altitude. They were able to keep observing it as we reached home. After quickly tucking me into bed, they returned outside to see if the object was still there. They claimed to witness the object continuously hovering at various spots over the ranch, almost as if it were searching for something. According to their account, it eventually stopped and remained suspended in mid-air. They described it as circular with lights encircling it. After hovering momentarily, it suddenly shot up vertically into the sky and disappeared from sight completely. They never spoke to me about this occurrence, and I only learned of it many years later while eavesdropping on one of their conversations with friends. Over the years, I have shared these experiences with others. It was during one of these discussions that the topic of strange dreams came up. It was then that someone suggested that those may not be ordinary dreams. A friend's father mentioned reading a book called Communion by Whitley Strieber, who coincidentally grew up in Alamo Heights, Texas. It was quite a coincidence since I ended up living there myself many years later. Whitley Strieber claims to have had encounters with aliens during his youth in Texas. So now, I'll share with you these two peculiar dreams I had while living on the ranch that, according to my friend's father, bear resemblance to something else. In one dream, I found myself lost in a department store, desperately searching for my aunt. The store seemed endless, filled with rows upon rows of clothing. I was sobbing and crying out for her because I felt utterly lost. As I walked down one of the aisles, I stumbled upon an open space in the middle of the store. There I saw a circular desk with nurses standing inside it. As I approached one of the nurses, still in tears, and expressing to her that I did not like my dream and I desperately wanted to wake up, she reassured me that she could help and requested my arm. I extended my arm to her, and she held it while she injected something with a syringe. As the shot was administered, everything slowly began to go black. The next thing I knew, I woke up in my bed with no sense of time having passed. It was like magic. One moment I was in the dream, and the next I was awake in my bed. The second dream was even stranger than the first. I found myself in a room entirely white. I sat on a bench that was seamlessly integrated into the wall itself, forming a single structure rather than two separate parts. I remember sitting there facing two tall figures standing behind a smaller one who was interacting with me. Although I have a vivid memory, I can't recall the faces of the two tall figures. Their features remain blurred. I can remember what they look like from the torso upward. I can only describe it as a feeling, but something told me that the two tall figures were organic, while the one I interacted with was more like a machine. The room was smooth and white, no hard corners or straight lines. I can't recall the faces or even the attire of the three figures. The only significant detail that I can recall from the dream was that the machine-like entity used the word glucose. The word haunted me for a week. It kept playing in my head over and over again. What does this word mean? It wasn't until I got together with an older friend that they informed me that glucose was another term for sugar. I was completely shocked, as I couldn't fathom how I would know that word from a dream when I had never heard it in my waking life. To put things into context, I was less than 10 years old when I heard this word in this dream. I don't know too many 10-year-olds who are familiar with terms like glucose and other scientific terms for those kinds of things at that age. In 1983, the ranch was eventually sold, and we moved to Castroville, Texas. The land now houses retirement homes for ex-military personnel. Various religions, legends, and belief systems feature descriptions of spiritual beings or supernatural entities referred to as shades. These figures' nature, whether they are good or bad, or something else entirely, remains a topic of debate. Some ufologists speculate that the Hat Man might be an extraterrestrial species observing human beings. The available data on the Hat Man primarily consists of first-hand accounts from individuals sharing their personal experiences. According to these accounts, people often perceive the Hat Man as an entity watching them from a doorway, closet, or corner of a room. Most reports suggest that the observation is the extent of the interaction, which supports the ufologist's hypothesis. However, other individuals claim that the Hat Man approaches them or hovers over them, reinforcing the scientific community's assertion that the Hat Man is experienced during episodes of sleep paralysis. Moreover, some accounts mention seeing the Hat Man during daytime while being awake and going about their daily activities. In terms of physical characteristics, witnesses describe the Hat Man as a completely dark entity resembling a shadow person. He is often depicted wearing a fedora or a hat with a long brim. Witnesses also note that the Hat Man appears to be wearing a trench coat. While some accounts mention red eyes, most people state that his face is obscured and they can only make out a general outline of his location. The Hat Man is commonly described as being approximately 6 feet tall. There are also instances where people associate sightings of the Hat Man with major traumas or traumatic events, suggesting a potential spiritual or emotion-driven connection to the shade or shadow figure that is not always acknowledged. So the question arises, was the disembodied voice I experienced a result of a mental breakdown or psychological event, as science would suggest? Or is it connected to the Hat Man phenomenon, which suggests that trauma somehow attracts this mysterious figure to individuals? With that subject in mind, there was trauma in the home. Many of my peers and friends at school were unaware of the severe suffering I endured due to my uncle's abusive behavior. As a former military personnel, he was extremely strict and subjected me to physical and emotional abuse. I experienced slapping, choking, having my head banged against walls, and being spanked with a leather belt on my bare skin. I was absolutely terrified of my uncle and kept this abuse a secret from everyone, my family, friends, and school authorities. I was afraid of the consequences if I were to reveal the abuse. I silently endured the pain, sometimes receiving intervention from my aunt, but sometimes this happened with just us two, with no one else around to intervene. Recently, a longtime friend shared with me an exchange between her mother and my Aunt Isabel. She says that my aunt tearfully confided with her mother that my uncle was excessively harsh with me. Throughout the years, I suffered silently. At school, I presented myself as a happy and funny person, often using humor to compensate for my anxiety and profound loneliness. Although my attempts to make others laugh were occasionally appreciated, they mostly resulted in annoyance, not just by other students, but by teachers as well. I can assure you that if you continue listening to this podcast, despite everything I've just shared with you, you will discover that this event with this Hat Man, shadow figure, whatever you want to call him, is not a part of trauma or my imagination. If you continue listening, you will find that my experience is going to be validated and come full circle over 30 years later in ways that you can never imagine. Now, because one of these encounters also involved a UFO sighting, I'm more inclined to believe that what I saw outside my window that night is alien in nature, as opposed to being a ghost or a shadow person. Thank you for taking time out of your day or your evening to listen to my story, get to know me a little bit better, and allowing me to share not just who I am for those of you that don't know me very well, but also to tune in and listen to all these fantastic stories I have to tell you. Thank you, and I hope you come and listen to my second episode in 2 weeks.